The Honourable Tim Grosser.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, this is the first time I've taken the floor in this Parliament. I'd like to congratulate you and your colleagues on your election. I'd also like to say, and I'm sure this is in common with every member of this House, having gone through this bizarre, slightly surreal thing that happens every 3 years called a general election, where we go back and account to the people that put us here. It's a great privilege, and I know all the members from whichever political party that they come would actually really cherish that opportunity, and I'm certainly one of them. The issue I wish to take up in this is the first matter mentioned by the Prime Minister, which is this actually stunning success for New Zealand Inc. in New York, the UN Security Council. And I really believe that this is something that happens about once in a generation, and it does deserve some extended consideration and discussion in New Zealand politics. I want to acknowledge all the people that have put their shoulder to the wheel, from our previous Prime Minister, Helen Clark, through to our current Prime Minister. I've watched him personally advocate strongly and very effectively with foreign leaders, and a whole team of officials who've really worked themselves into a grind by putting in the maximum effort to make this possible. But I absolutely would want to single out Murray McCully. I know Murray McCully now extremely well, professionally and I think personally. And I believe that without his sense of commitment, his drive and a travel program that makes my own look positively lackadaisical, I don't think we would have got over the line. So I do want to acknowledge that. You know, everybody in this House who's been around for a while knows the old nickname he used to have, Minister of Politics, and that applied to an earlier stage in his career. I don't imagine Mr. McCully would mind that in the slightest, because nothing is more important than to any individual than the respect of your peers, and he would never have attracted that nickname or sobriquet if it didn't imply respect for his political skills. And what he's done, Mr. Speaker, is apply those hard-won, carefully honed political skills to the biggest stage of international politics and come out with a success. So I do want to put on the record my views on that. As to the benefits, look, I'm aware of the wider arguments that are more centric on New Zealand interests, but actually, I don't disagree with them. But the core point is this. If one looks at the history of small states over literally thousands of years, from the Peloponnesian Wars to current crisis, it is clear what the core interest of small states is, which is global and regional peace and stability. That is, nothing imperils the sovereign existence in every sense and the liberties of the citizens of small states more than the absence of international peace and security and the rule of law. And for heaven's sake, whatever it cost, I have no idea how much it cost, we should be playing our part once every generation in putting our shoulder to the wheel to try and make a contribution. And the comments that I want to make today are really some reflections on what I think the nature of a contribution from a small, active state like New Zealand can be. We're in a difficult environment multilaterally around the world, and I think there are various reasons, but the core reason is a rather paradoxical one. And that is, if you look at the WTO, which is in terrible trouble, climate change negotiations, well, very difficult. We're trying to get a long-term agreement in place in 2009. It's been kicked forward to 2020. Now, I mean, I'm sure we'll get there, but it's very difficult to make multilateralism work. And the paradox, I think, is this, that actually it was easier to make it work when we had a single hegemonic power, the United States, driving this process. They had enormous creativity behind the process that they put in place when they were absolutely the supreme power after the war, with something like 50% of world GDP. But that situation, as we know, is changing. I'm optimistic that the emerging superpowers of China and India will play a very useful role, but the habits of cooperation are not well embedded between the BRICS and the traditional centres of developed country power. I think this does have a very important implication, Mr. Speaker, for the role of small states. One could sort of say with a military point in mind, that it's a very target-rich environment for small constructive states to operate and to use their skills and networks to build coalitions to help a multilateral system that in this process of transition, until habits of cooperation are more deeply embedded amongst the superpowers, can play a very, very important role. Power matters in international diplomacy. George Kennan, I say, regarded by many people as the finest strategic mind of the mid-20th century, the man who crafted the whole Cold War containment strategy to try and avoid literally nuclear annihilation between the then Soviet Union and the United States, said, and I quote, "The realities of power," as he said this in 1944, "the realities of power will soon seep into any legalistic structure which we erect to govern international life." So when power is a bit more diffuse, and there's no basis for looking to leadership from these more diffuse powers, this puts a bigger responsibility on responsible small states. Now, I think we're very good at this. I think we've had, frankly, generations of New Zealanders who've shown outstanding skills in this. I recall, for example, Chris Beebe. Chris Beebe, I first met Chris when I was about 9 years old, and my parents rented a house next to his parents' house, and of course he was a big boy of 14 and gave me all sorts of advice, none of which was probably very wise, but certainly found at the age of 9 very interesting. And of course I later became a colleague of his. He was more senior than me in the system. But Chris, an eccentric man, but an absolute genius. His standing in international legal circles was such, Mr. Speaker, that when we had Law of the Sea conferences, when we were setting up the frame, this is a huge issue for humanity and an issue of vital economic and political importance to this country, given that we have the world's 4th largest exclusive economic zone. The big powers would literally say, well, there's no point in having a meeting unless Beebe is there to chair it. So we've got a bit of a conveyor belt that's turned out world-class people of real skills who are very, very constructive. Now, we're not the only small state that does this. I really pay tribute to Norway's work, not in the same areas as we tend to focus on, but their work in the Middle East, where they've been used very constructively, albeit not enough, to try and forge peace coalitions of interest there. Sri Lanka, their incredible work in the Amazon, funding through their enormous sovereign wealth fund, hugely useful CDM projects that are helping humanity. So it's not like we should think we're the only people that can do this, but we're one of them. I remember once there was a very famous US negotiator called Warren Laverell, now sadly passed away. I thought the finest negotiator I've ever met. And I remember saying to him, I was particularly frustrated with the United States, sitting on the sidelines at one point in the Uruguay round. And I said to Mr. Laverell, who was a very, very senior negotiator, I said, you know, there's one thing New Zealand and the United States share in common in the international trading system, and that is we have influence totally disproportionate to our real power. It took him 2 weeks before he was prepared to speak to me again, but we made it up. So we have been able to use strategy very effectively under different governments, with different generations of New Zealanders. But I do want to think this, we can't sort of smugly think this is because we're cleverer than anyone else. You don't meet stupid people actually in international diplomacy. A core point behind our position is the strong domestic consensus in place. Look, when Colin Keating, who was then our permanent representative the last time we were there, made this famous statement on Rwanda, I can't recall his exact words, but it was something like the international community should be ashamed of themselves. Did he have instructions from his government? I very much doubt it. What Colin would have done was know what the core New Zealand value was, what the core New Zealand position. He wouldn't need to go back to Wellington and ask for his instructions on what he should say, because he knew where he stood. And this is a fundamentally, I think, important point. That, you know, there's a famous phrase by the great Prussian strategist, Field Marshal von Moltke, who said wisely, no battle plan survives the first engagement with the enemy. And having been a negotiator in the past, I can assure you that that's what an in-game negotiation is like. People get frightened, they don't have a clear domestic position, and that's when New Zealand knows exactly where the consensus lies in our country and get up and take an initiative on the basis of their own authority, knowing that they'll be able to sell it. And I wish to congratulate all those people who put us in this position, and I look forward to, at 2 years' time, hopefully congratulating them for their safe passage.
The Honourable Maggie Berry.
I move that this debate be now adjourned.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion will say aye. Aye. Those to the contrary, no. The ayes have it. Ayes have it. This debate is adjourned and is set down for resumption next sitting day. Call on Government Order of the Day number 1.
Employment Relations